All right, shalom, shalom, family. I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, all right. So I wanted to just take some time to do a direct live on a couple different informations that we had talked about before, as I think these are the topics of our time as we start to experience science and information that comes to the point of truth, as in this the sense of information that we can actually take, and no matter what generation comes, they're going to be looking at the same information. So that means from this generation to 100 generations forward, we can look at scientific information that we can look at in truth and establish if that information will be valid, valuable for understanding who are the ancient biblical people. So we're going to be looking at some of those things today. And also, I'm going to put a link in the chat if anyone has anything they want to talk about, they feel like they want to talk about anything at all. And I do want to study today directly, but we're going to be touching on some different information. So it's going to be a free talk today. But as we do the free talk, I'll be looking at a note that we had touched on before. And what I'll be doing is scrolling through that note and basically giving maybe a little correction, a little information about some things. But I think it's something that a lot of people like to talk about. And it's about this E1B1A line. Now, the reason why a lot of people want to talk about this line in particular, because it may be without a shred of doubt that this line, if you take its whole family in a whole entirety, you can start to find some very interesting things. Now, first, right off the bat, I want to talk about some emails that I had wrote to some geneticists just on some fundamental understandings of direct pinpoint snips of this line. The reason why is because I think biblical history is interesting. And if we can find a line that starts to point to like a biblical historical ties, that's pretty interesting to see. And what I've seen, and many geneticists have actually seen, is that some of these lines, when looking at more detail, tell us very interesting stories. For example, E-M2. Now, before I show what he said, let me just type down E-M2 and just go to like a wiki page. Now, wiki, obviously, I had talked about this before, is a secondary source, right? So we got to know it's a secondary source. But sometimes people see like wiki and they'll see like a design where we'll see this line here, but they'll forget some simple fundamental understandings when it comes to understanding history. One, we got to know throughout all ages of time. That means Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, all those times, all the shreds of time. Where would that line been in all those shreds of time? Not just one part, but where would it have been through all those shreds of time to get a first understanding of its total picture. And what it looked like is that this line was more Neolithic. This was a 100% Neolithic culture. It's not found in any Mesolithic or Paleolithic cultures, without a doubt. Now, some try to squeeze some of its cultures into a bronze or into a Neolithic culture. Now, I'm going to tell you why real fast. I'm just going to type something down. Got to type down this just so you can get this understood pretty much. I'm going to type down this area, but I need to go to a certain part of Africa to explain this. Let me actually bring it here. Okay, so what we got to know is obviously the Neolithic has different time frames. So you can sometimes see different time frames, and certain areas have different time frames of its time frame. So if I say Neolithic, Europe Neolithic, Middle East Neolithic, and Africa Neolithic might have different time frames, might have different dates on its time frame. The reason why that's important because usually when we think about the Neolithic, we're thinking about a time that is like before the biblical time frame. And the reason why I'm pointing this exact time frame out is because almost everyone uniformly believes that the biblical narrative would pop up transitioning from these cultures. So we would see the earliest cultures of the biblical text start to consist of said Neolithic cultures. Now, there's other ways of understanding this as well, because when you take the biblical narrative and you understand it's symbolically talking about clans and everything, the complexity of that is that we got to understand that some of these years that we see today and the years in the Bible, a lot of those years are exaggerated. So we know that Abraham, without a doubt, would have popped up around, we'll say 2000 BC, after 2000 BC, and some say like around 18 BC, and he'll pop up around 2018 BC, and that would be obviously after the Neolithic time frame into what would be called the the Bronze Age time frame. Now, we would say that in a sense of talking about the Mesopotamia, the Levant, and things like that. But when it comes to Africa, we start to notice something that starts to paint some different pictures. Now, there's an interesting brother of M2 that's usually misunderstood. I'm going to point that out real fast. It comes from V38 right here. So M2 has a brother lineage right here. And he has a deep, deep root that actually is found in the areas of East Africa. And it's actually interesting because when we think of this omic line, it talks about it that it has connections with a line that I had to send a message to the geneticists about, which are the Natufian. The reason why, because something recently had happened in genetics that actually caused this fact to link that M2 used to be an African branch, but because the brother of M2, which is this branch right here, sometimes called E1B1A2, because M2 is actually E1B1A1, or this one is also called E1B1AC. The reason why that's important, because I'm going to point something out with E1B1AC and believe E1B1AC and E1B1A has an importance to recognize with these ones. But this one has an early line that pops up in the areas of East Africa. Now, the reason why that's important, because once you start studying on East Africa as an ancient culture, you'll start to realize something really interesting about East Africa, is that East Africa had a gap in time. So there's like a Neolithic Bronze Age gap. Now, the reason why I say that is because when you start looking at East Africa, you'll notice that, you'll have a lot of ancient groups, a lot of ancient A and B groups down there and stuff like that. We know that there were ancient cultures there for a long time, for a very, very long time. But there's an interesting fact about what happens between the divisions of Y chromosomes, CT and BT. CT actually makes some different lineages that are not going to be the typical, how they'll say, the Cochin hunter-gatherers that would be down in Africa, that they'll say they were down there for a long time and they were agriculturalists. Some farmers start to move down there. And that's the reason why that's interesting, is because they'll still count Africa at that time as basically the Neolithic. So now when I say the Neolithic, I'm talking around 2000 BC. And around those times, that would still be called Neolithic in Africa, just to kind of get this understood, because I'm going to work my way to something to get this understood, for example. But any questions, any statements, let me know, because we'll touch on some of those things. But when we start to get to about, I would say, let's say about in the Levantan area, it would be about Bronze Age. But in the African area, it would still be about Neolithic, but it would technically be in the Bronze Age of the world's existence. The reason why that's important is because this area and this area is actually not that far from each other. In fact, Africa actually goes through a Bronze Age. Sometimes in the areas of Lower Africa, you'll see that they will have like Neolithic cultures going on in these lower areas. That's just something that I think is important. So first is this, just to know, this is the East Africa. So sometimes you'll have different areas like West Africa. That's going to be kind of different, but I want to kind of put a center of attention on East Africa. And the reason why is because that's kind of the hot spot area where they say that like humans began. And it'll kind of be basically washed on E and say, well, E must have had began there as well. But when we start looking at the ancient cultures there, it's interesting that E is not early on East Africa, but it's early in West Africa. West Africa will see some E's around these areas, but that's a certain group. That's not going to be the E1B1A that we focus on that is Israelites. That one, when we find that one starts to point us to what's really going on with the picture. But notice again, East Africa is an area that usually, is a lot of studies on. A lot of people, they usually know about the eastern part of Africa and all those things. But there's a certain line that I'm gonna see if they mention on here. I'll just mention it right here. There's a certain line that I'm gonna type down. In fact, I'll just go back because it's right on here. So even right here, it'll talk about the replacements that happen. So it'll talk about basically how E1B1A1, which is M2, actually would replace some of those Koshin groups that we would just talk about in the Neolithic Africa and the Lower Africa. But they do it within a time frame that if you try to look up Bronze Age Africa, you won't really get a lot of information that separates the understanding of Neolithic Africa and Bronze Age Africa, which is actually really important to understand how the complexity is in Bronze Age Africa compared to Neolithic Africa. And also the reason why that's important is because Africa goes through a Bronze Age, because the Nubians, they have bronze, and they go through a Bronze Age, and other groups in Africa go through a different Bronze Age. That's really important just to kind of get a good understanding of real fast. I want to type something down real fast to kind of show on here. Get the wording on this thing. I'm going to pull up. Okay, here he is. Okay, so when does Mota actually come into the areas of East Africa? It's actually in this time frame right here. Now, in the deep areas of Africa, let me just actually break this down real fast. Why is this quickly important? Because as you see, V38 actually would divide and actually go into a couple of different areas. It actually is found in Neolithic France. It's actually found in Neolithic France. But then some of its groups become herders. They basically move herds around, and you can also follow them with the herds. And if you follow them with the herds, what you'll find out is that into the areas of the pastoral Neolithic, this would actually be a time frame that they would say within this time frame there was a transition. There was a transition of groups that were moving pastoral products and different ones in prehistory, moving into the areas of Africa. Now, what's interesting about it is that it may not seem like a big deal, but some would say that E started here and came out. But what's interesting is we see an E group actually transition into here. And then that's actually important. The reason why that's important because that line is called Mota. And that Mota line actually would move into the areas of Africa during this pastoral Neolithic time frame. Now, understand what I'm saying here. I'm talking about a back migration into Africa for this E group. Now, this E group is also highly African, but is also highly Middle Eastern. And this actually would tie a lot of genetics together as it says right here, Afro-Asiatic languages are spoken by modern groups in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. So what's interesting about that, we'll start noticing a linguistic and genetic contribution, not just in the east of Africa. That's what makes it really interesting, because if we get a group going into Africa, not going upwards through Africa, but going into Africa, we'll notice that it will connect a few different families together. And one family in particular I usually talk about and maybe go into like the details very often, very much so, is one in particular that, like I said, when I brought certain information together, it gave us the establishment to the truth. For example, when I asked E-M2 is common throughout sub-Saharan Africa and also in the Near East. So it could represent a back migration in the Near East. So this is actually a quote that a geneticist had sent to me after I had sent them information about the Neolithic finds of the ancient, basically E groups that were in the Neolithic areas, even before the Neolithic areas of Eurasia. Now, that's family ties. And I think family ties is important when tying groups together, because it would tell us where certain ones would have divided and where the divisions had went. But long story short, they did let us know that there was a back migration. But there is one more piece that I want to point out on here that I think is also important on this thing. Now, notice what group what group they also have mentioned, because on this piece of paper, right, just to show this, I had sent some information, and then they had sent some information, and they talked to me directly about the Natufian. Now, I want to show you something from a video that we had did a while back. So I want to show you something from a video we just did a live on the Natufian, and some information that I added it to it. So I'm just gonna go to it. Go right here. All right. All right. So let me just read you an interesting thing that I found. I want to read and get understood, because I think it's kind of interesting. This is what it says. It is a further surprise that the Epi-Paleolithic Natufians of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm, was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. So now this is interesting. This is interesting because I'm going to show you that this is not just we don't not no pseudo source. We just pulling up some information that's letting us know that the Natufians have some connection to sub-Saharan Africa, right? If the late Paleocene Natufian samples from Israel is the source from which the Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present in almost equal importance as the late prehistoric Eurasian element. Now, this is actually interesting because this would rewrite some mental capacities that would write certain groups or certain people that look a certain way as African only. Remember, this is actually something I did a live on, that some groups conclude beforehand a only theory. And the only theory is a theory that basically is saying, oh, the groups that we actually find in, how you say, one area, they must have always been in that area and never moved. Or they must have always been in that area throughout all time. But really, let the information speak, and the information would tell you rather something interesting. But this is the questionable contribution of the Neolithic. Remember how I was talking about the in-between Neolithic Bronze Age? That's why looking at that carefully, those years carefully, the in-between Neolithic Bronze Age would squeeze out some in-between information on the real routes of certain groups, certain movements of certain groups. So questionable contribution of the Neolithic and Bronze Age to basically the cranial form, or cranial facial form, pretty much. And that's pretty much what they were looking at. And obviously looking at these groups, looking at the Natufian and stuff of Israel and whatnot. And they see that they bring a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what we got to understand first is who's older. Is the sub-Saharan African E group, is there a sub-Saharan African E group that would link the Natufian older into Africa, or is the Natufian one of the oldest E groups? And that's what we actually find, is that the Natufian and some of the E groups in Eurasia are older in Eurasia because CT splits in Eurasia. CT makes DE, and DE goes to Japan and makes, in the Neolithic time frame, right? Remember, in that same Neolithic time frame. And also, let me point something out right after this one. So the Yoman people, these are ancient Neolithic groups. So you can see how old they would be, but these would have a D. These would have a D group among them. So these would have some ancient cultures that would exist a long time ago, but a lot of them would be pre-Neolithic, Neolithic, and pre-Neolithic. But they have that D group that would have split in the areas of Eurasia a long time ago. So that's the D and E group split in Eurasia, because the D group, for it to be in Neolithic Eurasia, means they had to split a long time ago in Eurasia. Now, with that understood, we already see that the Natufian and this Yoman group, these are real cultures by name that would exist in a Neolithic time in certain areas. So when I asked them directly about the connection of this group by name to the ancient group, it was an assured statement when we get an understanding that there could be a back migration. Now, they're not going to, this is one of the biggest things a lot of times when it comes to a set motive. You don't automatically just get, yeah, you won. Yeah, you're right. You get more of a, that information does correlate. That information does come together, or that information that is true. That's what you usually get, is putting that conclusion to the factual information. Now, again, going back to why is that important? Why is that important? Because if we know that if we had these early E groups, and these ones were like E1, B1, P2 groups. So P2 is very important because it ties together a major group of families. And that means that major group of families may have left from areas of the Levant, and the Neolithic area might have a centerpiece of origin of humans, a Neolithic bottleneck origin of humans that would have left out of Fertile Crescent, but obviously filling up areas of Africa and Eurasia and other places around in Europe and other areas of Asia. But this group in particular, E-M2, didn't start in Africa and remain only in Africa, but it started in Eurasia, went into Africa, and there was groups that developed in Eurasia and Africa. And that's what's important about this line, is that the full entirety of this line is that it would be a Fertile Crescent line, like a Eurasian African lineage. That's what this line would be. And that's important because that makes sense for the movements of Afro-Asiatic and then Semitic, and then the kind of growth of those major groups. That's more of a widely painted picture, because that's actually what I believe that the scriptures is more painting, is that Adam and Eve would have been a genetic node separating many people into real genetic groups. And we want to actually have seen, just like we see with almost all the languages that we see, Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Semitic, they all match up. They will all start to match up. So when we think about the Semitic origins and all that, the areas from Mesopotamia, that makes perfect sense, right? We don't find that origin of Semitic coming from somewhere in, South America or something like that, or from the corners of America, but we find Afro-Asiatic, which also the biblical text uses Hebrew and all that, and centered around the Levant and Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. All those linguistic ties being around the areas of Africa and Eurasia, and the biblical text goes into Africa and Eurasia. So it's really interesting how it gives you that first it's like giving you a key without a doubt of his movements. And even there's the sayings where you'll get in the Psalms and other places where it'll talk about Africa being the land of Ham. It'll talk about Egypt, going to Egypt, and like he's showed them wonders in the land of Ham, and these things, that, in the lands of Ham. And obviously you'll hear other places in the scripture where it talks about Japheth from the north and all those different things like that. So there's this reality. There's a literal reality of whom is whom. And what's interesting is, after the Neolithic bottleneck, every single human living today comes from one male group, a pinpoint bottleneck male group. And that's that some people don't know it, but it's that BT and CT split line. So BT and CT split line must have, in the Neolithic, had that Neolithic bottleneck, because that's when we get that explosion of different males. If you know what I'm talking about, I'll just type it down. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out because I'm contemplating whether to do a review on this one video. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but there's a video that some Christians are starting to say that not everybody came from Noah. So some people are concluding that if we were to take these things genetically, some people will conclude that some people are not children of Noah. Like basically concluding that the conclusion that the biblical text in multiple different areas of the scriptures historical writings and other places that contest that we would come from an ultimate, obviously, Adam. But some people conclude that not everyone's from Adam. So I think that everyone's from Adam, and everyone who's living today is from Noah, who survived a catastrophic wipeout event. And I think there's a lot of evidence for it. I just think that if you try to conclude it, if you try to say the Big Bang Theory is true and try to make things billions of years and try to say the Bible is true and is only saying 6,000 years, then you're contradicting what the Bible is saying on a couple of different ways. You can either, this is only the only two ways to go about it. You either take the biblical numbers as symbolic, and you can't make it 6,000 years, because you can't make it 6,000 years if you say the numbers are symbolic, right? Or you take the numbers as literal and you see the Big Bang and the concept of these millions and billions of years, error on the calculations on humans' parts, that humans are assuming that light particles would have took such and such a long time to get to us, or assuming the rate of how much material would have been here at the beginning of creation. To say that based upon these layers or based upon this and that, this must be this old, right? Or it might be more for a factual sake, as we had examined, that the world began as water, creating multiple layers. And also later on, we had a flood creating multiple layers. That these multiple layers should be accounted for, that we would have these catastrophic events to count layers. Besides multiple different fallacies of radiocarbon dating, carbon dating, and all the different things that go in between, right? That's another topic. And we can always have that conversation when talking things of micro and macro evolution. If you don't know, real fast, I know this kind of getting off, but all this has to do with like the Neolithic bottleneck. I don't know why I keep typing Neolithic like that. But if you know about the conversations that a lot of people have, some people have this, right? If you ever seen this, the conversation of macro versus micro evolution. So these are actually two different things. One is more realistic. One is more of a fantasy. And the more realistic, this is why I say I myself, I don't believe all evolution, but evolution, there are some concepts of evolution that are true, like micro evolution. Micro evolution is true. Macro evolution is not true. And I can provide enough sources scholarly to prove that macro evolution is not true. And if someone thinks macro evolution is true, you can also provide some sources for that, and we can look at that genetically. And I guarantee you, if you take that by a genetic factor instead of just bone structure, you'll realize something interesting in the genetics, that humans and animals they don't branch like this, but they're separate. There's a couple of different separate branches that can make different groups of their family. So there's different kinds that make different families, and they have different variations. So there's a difference between micro and macro evolution, just to make that understood. That if you want to know what I believe about these things, I believe that there is evidence of microevolution. There's no doubt evidence of microevolution. So microevolution is true. There is an evidence of microevolution, and there is evidence of microevolution. So when someone says is evolution true or not, usually they're focusing on the concept of the whole totality of microevolution and macroevolution. But microevolution is true, macroevolution not so true. But if someone wants to talk about that, we can talk about that. I've talked with different people on that. But let me show you what I'm talking about in particular, this event in particular, during the Neolithic time frame. So second, Neolithic founder effect from small populations of small Neolithic pioneers, so small groups of Neolithic pioneers, could create apparent bottleneck in modern Y chromosomes. So long story short, there has been evidence of a mysterious bottleneck that happened on the Y chromosome. A lot of different people talk about it. They know that it has close ties to what they call the Younger Dryas event. I had talked about that before, that has evidence of a catastrophic flood event, wipeout event. a catastrophic destruction event. So it's no doubt when we look at a lot of these things. But you got to take that in consideration with what the text is saying, because this is more of a change of speciation. Because at this time, between the older and younger Dryas, the Neanderthals, Denisovans, ancient humanoid types were wiped out. All those ancient humanoid types were gone by the end of the said younger Dryas. That's what caused the Neolithic bottleneck. That all modern humans today, because that's what this actually is. This actually is all modern humans. That's what this actually is. All modern humans today, all modern Y chromosomes, all modern humans are going to be from basically a small group that survived a massive wipeout event. So that's actually something that's important to know about. And that's actually important because every single one of those humans is someone today. That's what makes it important, that every single one of those humans that came out of this event are people today. So there's a little more to go into it. If you ever wanted to go directly into this one, I also have a note on it, on that Neolithic bottleneck. But the reason why I wanted to give a summary of that, because that event, that time frame, right? Some people that they see these years is about understanding that the sequence of events is true. The biblical text is writing things harmoniously to the sequence of events. So we know that if we take Abraham and look at him scientifically as a physical culture, we can find evidence of Abraham and his family and his cultures, right? Midianites, Ishmaelites, Moabites, Ammonites, right? All the descendants around them, right? Cousins, nephews, uncles, all those and whatnot. We can find evidence of that. But we got to find out where they began, right? What's the origin of these groups? And I do believe, without a doubt, this Neolithic grouping has the most secrets to the rising of this biblical text. But it's also the reason why Neolithic, because it's squished together with the Bronze Age. So some of the information is squished together in the Bronze Age, but you got to look at it carefully. You got to look at the stuff carefully, very carefully. But with that understood, that's why when looking at certain lines, that's when we can kind of get to a conclusion on who may be whom. And I want to do a separate study on basically the time frame of these divisions, because I already did a study on the time frame of these divisions. But was also interesting is that still to this day you'll get individuals that will kind of almost ignore the time frame on these divisions, and it brings us a very interesting picture when that's ignored, when these divisions are ignored. But let me just go over real fast because I want to point out one certain picture in particular. All right, so when getting a good understanding of these lines, like let's say this certain line, I believe it starts at E1, B1, P2. Now P2 is the key. That's what's the key of the whole understanding of this line here. E1, B1, P2. That's what's the key there to understanding this line and how it divides. And the areas that it goes make sense. A lot of different areas that this line goes make sense. But we have to look at where would it have started? What would have been its origins? Where would it have started at? Where would it came from and everything? So this is what I think will tell us the key is the Abrahamic line had to be E1, B1. And a lot of areas where it went matches up for areas of the biblical text. So it starts to make a very interesting picture also when you start to look at the ancient cultures of that land, ancient groups that were in that land. And it paints a very harmonious picture, which we already went through. We went through the evidence of the rise of Abraham into the movements of the people going into the areas of Egypt, Africa. And we already know about what happened when they came out of Egypt, Africa, and they settled in the area of Levant, developing into a Iron Age culture. And then what happened, we know that the Assyrians basically replaced them. We know that because the biblical text tells us and evidence tells us that the Assyrians came and removed a lot of their ancestor bones and stuff, and they were destroying their ancestors and stuff, removing their bones from the tombs and start living there, which also the book of Kings tells us that the Assyrians started to dwell in the place where Israel was for a long time. So a lot of nations started to kind of replace them until they came back and forth throughout that land. But the evidence of these groups is always in the history of them. So I think a lot of this stuff is viewed best in the history of them. So when we actually were climbing this genetic ladder and finding these evidence, more and more things came together. Like, for example, the evidences of the L lines in Eurasia, which not a lot of times these L lines are shown to be in Eurasia. But when searched, you can find them in Eurasia. You can find some of them in Eurasia, and you can give us an understanding of those things. But nothing really too deep today, family. Just a little bit of summary of some stuff that I think is kind of interesting. So I do recommend checking out this little video that we did on the Natufian. This one is when we was reviewing this little short that one of the individuals had made, which was basically about how the Natufian invented agriculture and they became the world's first farmers. And that's why that pastoral Neolithic and the pastoral areas that are all around are important, because just because we find a group that's there doesn't mean that they're only isolated to only that area. But it actually starts to make sense when you start to connect some of the linguistic movements and the fact of how the pastoralists makes a difference with other groups and how they started to move, Afro-Asiatic and stuff like that. So it's very interesting when looking at those things in a total picture. So again, today, nothing too serious today. I got some stuff set aside I'm working on. But if you have any questions about, let me go back here, anything that we did so far, anything on the playlist, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's all we got for now, family. That's all we got for now. I just wanted to talk a little bit of the stuff on his note and some highlights about some things on his note and about looking at some information and about migrations of certain groups, back migrations, forward migrations, because that's what this note was, is that we actually found out that, again, instead of like a African origin of these groups, that it seemed that a lot of groups would have started around Eurasia and would have branched around upper areas of Africa for modern humans, right? For modern humans, that they would have started in the areas of upper areas of Africa and Eurasia. They would have started in multiple areas and then branched into other areas. As other linguists have found that it was evident that modern humans might have started more in the areas of Eurasia, but also in areas of mid-Africa. So that's why I say I believe the cradle of human origins is the Fertile Crescent, right? The Fertile Crescent, I believe, is the cradle of human origins, where everyone comes from. So I believe it's the Fertile Crescent that people settled there early on, especially modern humans, especially modern humans. So that's pretty much it for now. I'm gonna just leave it like that. So it's just these little things I want to point out is, what inspires us to look into more the depth of genetics and more the depth of history, and not just like guessing at stuff, because we don't want to just say that just because we may think we know everything, we don't want to say we know everything, because I don't know how people are coming to the understanding that ancient people or people today are not people from the flood or not all from Noah, or that some people just aren't from Noah. I think that conclusion is kind of toxic, and I think it's important to study genetics carefully and history carefully, and also remember what you say, because if you say that the years in the Bible are symbolic, we got to remember that. Don't all of a sudden say that the Bible's narrative is pointing at 6,000 years from us to Adam. Don't say it's been 6,000 years if you're saying the years are symbolic. Because if those years are symbolic, that means they can be longer than what they are showing, without a doubt. So that's something that we got to understand with clans. But if you're saying that things are 6,000 years and you're a young earth creationist and you go by the word for word, and you got enough information to prove that, then amen. You probably got a solid doctrine to prove that. But if someone's an old earth creationist, You need to take the biblical narrative carefully and examine those years if they're exaggerated. If those years are exaggerated, if you're not a young earth creationist and you're an old earth creationist, examine the biblical years carefully. Don't just take the same young earth creationist method and take 6,000 years and not say that those years are symbolic, because those years are symbolic if you say you are taking the old earth method. You can only take those years literal if you're taking the young earth method. You cannot take those years literal if you're taking the old earth method. So I'm just saying that for now because I have a plan on waiting, but I have a build up in me on a video comment that was spoken of recently. But let's make sure it's understood that if someone wants to challenge that, we should look at it scholarly. But we should also understand the difference between the two methods. That you have an old earth method, that those years in the Bible are going to be symbolic based on the old earth method, because you can't go and say in the beginning God created all this and then say, well, he's not actually talking about the beginning. Okay, then what time frame is he talking about? And don't just say it was 6,000 years. Okay, because that's the old earth method will be destroyed by using that. Because then if I start questioning you on are those men actually thousands of years old, then you might be like, no, those are clans. And then if I ask you, how do we know those clans are actually that age? How do we know that those age are not multiplied? Because they are clans. That's important to understand how that concept would work, how you would multiply those clans. That those years that it's saying of Adam, those years, if you're taking it as clans, then you're saying that every year that Adam is actually there, right? They're saying Adam is such and such 900 years and whatnot. You got to remember that if those aren't talking about Adam's lifespan, if it's not talking about Adam's lifespan, you can't use that method as a sense that there was a quote unquote generational tribe that lasts that long, because that would mean that if you was to break down that tribe individually, each generation, and say like this was this is that, and then he brought another son, and they had sons and daughters, and that all those were different clans and generations, and we're saying that that's how long those clans and generations last. It was like 900 something years. Then we're not understanding the text at all. We'll be completely not understanding the text. I think we should look at it carefully and maybe compare that with even like apostolic writers, other writers, and look at it more carefully on how you would make that. Because I'm starting to see that. I'm starting to see old earth creationists go with a 6,000 year length for the time of Adam and say that the earth is billions of years, millions of billions of years, and say Adam just popped up around the Neolithic time frame, right? So he would have had one haplogroup, and all his descendants from Ham, Shem, and Japheth would have had one haplogroup. And then that same haplogroup that Ham, Shem, and Japheth would have had would have been passed on to the Jews, which would have had one haplogroup. And they all would have had that same haplogroup. Because in the Neolithic time bottleneck, if we're saying that they would have been just one haplogroup, separate from the grouping, and not everyone in that Neolithic bottleneck, then that's the conclusion that someone's making, that genetically it's saying the Jews would have one haplogroup. Ham would have that same haplogroup. Japheth all of them would have that same haplogroup. So let's say Ham, Shem, and Japheth was a haplogroup. That means Ham, Shem, and Japheth was a haplogroup, and every a haplogroup is a Jew, and every a haplogroup would be an Israelite. Every a haplogroup would be Ham. Every a haplogroup would be Japheth. Every a haplogroup would be Shem. That's what that would mean. That's what people aren't thinking about when they're saying that not all people are from Noah. So all people today, there's a small group today that was a bloodline that was chosen, or are you saying it's not a bloodline? It's all symbolic. So what was Messiah when he was born from a woman? What was that woman? right? And what was the men and all that? It's the complexity of problems that happens when people say, I know everything. That's the problem that happens when people go outside either what the scripture is saying or what logic is saying, what science is saying. Science says we all come from the same person. Science shows it, right? In multiple ways. In multiple ways, we come from the same person. Not just like your ancient Adam. There's a middle Adam, and there's a CT, your Asian Adam, right? And so this is just something that I think is important to understand when thinking about these things, you know. So I just wanted to say that openly real fast, because I feel like there's a couple of different things that have to be broken down and understood when taking the old earth concept and the young earth concept. And what I've been showing lately is a old earth concept, but with the understanding that the years are symbolic, that the years of the Bible are symbolic, so the old earth concept can make sense. But if you take a biblical text that is only 6,000 years, put that going from the Neolithic time frame, from the old earth, and say that not everybody is from Adam, just the people from the that Neolithic group, their physical bloodline from that time frame, then they have to be from a certain SNP, right? Technically, they have to be from a genetic SNP, a genetic marker. Or are they saying they're not human? They have to be human, so they have to come from a genetic marker. So that genetic marker has to pop somewhere around 6,000 years ago. Now, what if someone was to say, what if I was to say, I can doubtlessly show you, right, that M2 popped around 6,000 years ago, right? What if I was to take the same method and say E-M2 also has 12 branches and everything, but it also, besides that, we know that looking at its age and everything and how old it is, genetics actually shows, I'm gonna point it out on this as I say it, so that it doesn't seem like I'm just making it up. But genetics, if you look at the genetics and you look at this haplogroup and how long it existed, based on the science and based on even the biblical narrative and everything, it almost seems like this one would be about 6,000 years old, pretty much. If we take the fossils and the actual finds, because we don't have any real fossils of it that are over 10,000 years old that we can confirm. But what we can confirm is the fact that this line will be about 6,000 years old. So what will be that line? That's what's interesting about some questions and some things. So I'm just kind of throwing this out there to make this understood, because the reason why is because this is actually a real conversation that is happening recently. Some people are talking about this, and I think it's important. I'm just trying to remember where that is on here. Most recent common ancestor. Let me see if I could just type it down and find it within the note. Yeah, somewhere over here. I'll just point out right from this thing right here. All right. So I'll just read it from the genetic paper. This is what it says right here. It says, obviously, it hasn't been yet 7,000 years, right? Based on the biblical text, if we're going plain off the years, we can say that E1B1A as a whole, what it says right here, was estimated at 6,175 to 6,500 years before present. So if we can understand that this will be a line that as a whole for E1B1A will pop out around the Neolithic time frame, then one could say that, let's say if we use that concept, M2 would be that atom. From the atom of that line comes a bunch of its different families. So somewhere within the midst of M2 comes Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Also will come forth the existence of the 12 sons of Israel. No one else is part of Adam. No one else is part of Noah. The rainbow that came up was just for a local flood group. And this will be that one. That to me don't make sense. To me, that does not make sense. I don't think that makes sense. And I don't think that that is logically what the scripture is saying. I don't think that's what the scripture is saying. I think the scripture is telling us these years and these numbers, and we have to take them symbolically. We have to understand them. Either we take them symbolically or literally. If we take them literally, then we have to take the young earth creation as method. We have to. We have to assume that that humans today have exaggerated the years, and we have to prove that they exaggerated the years. And shockingly, we can. There's actually evidences that can prove that a lot of these years that they're putting are exaggerated, and a lot of estimated years are exaggerated. So that's something that we can actually prove in different ways. But let's say someone doesn't have enough information to prove that. Let's say they doubt that and everything. They think the earth is old, and they feel like they have to stick on the science. There's perfect ways of going about it scientifically with the biblical text to understand that if you take the biblical text of those years from Noah, you can get about 50,000 years. If you take the clan concept from Noah, right, and Adam and all that, you can easily get pretty much 100,000 years easy. You can get easy 100,000 years exaggeration or more, because if you take the biblical text as the years being symbolic, and also talking about tribes for lines before Adam, before Abraham. So times of Noah to the lines before, you'll get those stretches of years. But you got to understand what's happening in those results. You got to understand what's happening in those results. So that's one of those things that we got to understand. If there was a flood, these years will be exaggerated. And like I said, you can find a lot of evidence for these things. There's a lot of different evidence for these things. But I don't believe that Adam had one genetic group that popped up around only the Neolithic time frame. But I do believe Adam would have been the previous earliest modern human. That's what I think Adam would have represented. And that the exaggeration of those years has to be understood. There's just something that's supposed to be understood. The reason why is because the biblical text is telling Israel and the people a origin story. Some people say no, but if you take every single apostolic, every single early Jew, they understood that they were being told an origin story, right? We can take apostolic first century Christians, we can take second century Christians, we can take early Christians, and we can take the Jews. We can take Josephus, for example. We can take first century Josephus, who had the writings and was with the Jews at that time, and other writers in different times. And we can point out that what they really seen was that these groups were genetic groups that filled the whole earth today. The biblical text is telling you that this event is might be larger than one can grasp. That what God is writing is a summary. He's writing a mental summary to understand that they are a new people. And yeah, they came from an origin of people, but he's taking them and separating them and making them a new people. But the whole beginning is harmonious. If you take the whole understanding that the earth actually began as a ball of water, God said the earth began as a ball of water, literally. When you take the scriptures word for word, science word for word, and look at all those things word for word, the only thing that's different is the exaggeration of years. But harmoniously, from the beginning of creation to now, even from the factual evidence that there was a catastrophic bottleneck event, a catastrophic flood event that caused basically humans to be only modern humans today, only modern humans of certain nodes, certain groups of BT and CT for men. We know that all modern humans that exist today, they exist after a bottleneck, right? So that's what brings the understanding, is that when you take these things side by side, you see a harmonious understanding of creation. But the only problem is that when you're not examining the stuff. So it's one thing to say I don't know, but it's another to say I know without a doubt. If you know without a doubt, I hope you also have a source to provide the evidence for it, because I don't want anyone who's on this page saying that not everyone came from Noah. Not every modern human today came from Noah, because we got evidence, right? We got evidence that genetic BT and CT would make all lines that would be from a Eurasian said bottleneck. That's important to understand, that all humans today do show that they are 100% obviously from a genetic Adam and a genetic Eve who lived together at the same place. And also the fact that all modern humans who live today all exist today coming from a catastrophic bottleneck event. So that's something that's actually really interesting to notice, that most likely the biblical narrative is giving us a major summary of creation. That's what it's telling us, rather, a major summary of creation. But we can't look at it at a 1-by-1 ratio. You can't look at it as a 1-by-1 ratio, because if you take it as a 1-by-1 ratio and you believe in old Earth, you can't take it as a 1-by-1 ratio. But if you believe in young Earth, you can take it as a 1-by-1 ratio. 1-by-1, basically, you take the Bible word and you take history or the evidence of what we see today, you put it together. And we can see that very well put by a lot of young Earth creationists. But an old Earth creationist can't also be a young Earth creationist. So an old Earth creationist can't also go with 6,000 years. They're going to have to realize that those years are exaggerated. They have to, or else they'll be ignoring the fact that the years are exaggerated, right? And when I say they're ignoring the fact of that, it's kind of like, how am I gonna put this? It's kind of like, there was a global wipeout event. There was a flood, but you want to make it fit. You want to make it fit for something local, because if you try to make it global, you need to prove it in almost such a cartoonish way that you won't be able to fill in the evidence. Because a lot of people don't understand that the biblical narrative is not giving you a 1-to-1 ratio on the Genesis narrative. It's not giving you a 1-to-1 ratio. It's giving you a summary of it. It's giving you a detailed summary of it. So when it's telling you these years, when it's telling you these clans, when it's telling you these groupings, it was written in a way that the Mesopotamians can understand it. That is a simple symbolic origin story of their creation, of their being. That's to separate them mentally from other groups, to see that they are a special, separate being made different. That's why he talks about, even when he separated the sons of Adam, right? The sons of God, then he made the bounds for the children of Israel, right? So if he said he separated from the sons of Adam, so is he saying like it was a small group of Adam and he separate those ones and made Israel? Or is he really letting us know that out of the whole world, his concentration was on bringing salvation from Israel? And then when the Messiah came, he was going to bring that salvation to everyone. The new Adam, the concept of a new Adam, right? Some people will take the concept of like that being a priest, like Messiah, new Adam, priest, Adam, the old Adam, a priest. That's an interesting concept when you look at it, but it has a couple problems. Besides the fact that Adam wasn't a priest, nor did he have the station of a priest. How do we know? Because a priest is a judge. A priest, if you go to the scriptures, whenever there's a priest, their order is to have judgment over all the holy things, how to be over the holy things, how to do this thing and the holy things. But Adam was not given the understanding of knowledge of good and evil. He didn't know how to judge evil. So how can he be a priest? How can he understand the evil, do the things in the place when he doesn't have the understanding of good and evil? His goal was only to be he was, as it said, to rule over all those things, to have dominion over it. So when he made men to have dominion, like rulers. It was all to rule. But the problem with the beginning and the whole understanding of it is that when God made everything, he brought all those things to Adam to name them and all those things, is that when the fall happened, we got to remember there was no death yet. There was no death. The concept of death, the concept of surely dying, the concept of the fall and all those things, the concept of being cut off from that area and the details of it is all illustrated that this was the beginning. This was the very beginning of man. This is the very beginning, the very origin of mankind. But there's a lot of different details, scriptures, and different other individuals that tell us that those beginnings really were beginnings. Really were beginnings. I remember sometimes some would say, like, some writers would try to say it was 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago. Right? I seen some say that Irenaeus said it was 12,000 years ago. So that means that we got to be careful on the concept of these years, right? So that's very important. But on a spin, I just wanted to have a little quick moment. It's just a free live, Shalom family, on basically ranting, having a conversation about the genetic information and factual information about the Bible. Because this is a mental, what I want to do is also establish a mental understanding on something, a mental understanding of something. And that mental understanding is that if you look at the world genetically, right, you see this map right here, we took hours and hours mapping genetic humans that came all after about, you'll say, the modern age, right, the modern age of time, pretty much. The times, obviously, after the dinosaurs, all that stuff, right? And so there's certain little grouping of this, like this map, this little grouping of areas that we see here. The world that looks like this, all modern humans, when the world looked like this, we who had studied things like, let's say, like the young Earth creation method. The young Earth creation method says that basically Pangea was the split at the moment of the flood. That obviously would exaggerate the years. But if we was to say, let's say, if we was to say there is evidence that most likely these continents move faster than what people thought, then that's interesting to look at. And there's some interesting stuff on that. So there's different ways of combating these things, of going about it and looking at it. If you take the young Earth method, yeah, you can easily understand what this is. That this is every single thing we see today genetically of ancient modern humans, but the years are exaggerated. But if you take the old Earth creationist method, they would say that all the humans that have 1, 2, 3 up to 4 didn't exist, or don't exist, don't come from Adam. And about 5, all the humans from 5, that's when we would have the people that would exist during the time of Adam. And it's saying that basically 5 or 3, you have basically an in-between time frame of Adam existing, and somehow he would just be an individual, give you a physical individual that pops up, a physical individual who has a genetic line that apparently popped up only in the Neolithic. Remember, why am I saying this? Why, you probably wonder why I'm saying this. If Adam had no beginning from no man, and he only existed in the Neolithic, hear me when I say this, is he human? And if he is human, does his genetic line only pop up in the Neolithic? That means that the descendants from Adam, the descendants from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the descendants from Israel would have only existed in the Neolithic 6,000 years ago. You hear what I'm saying here? I don't know if you understand what I'm saying here. I'm telling you this: anyone who takes the old Earth method and says that Adam popped up 6,000 years ago cannot prove that genetically. They cannot prove that Adam popped up 6,000 years ago. He developed Ham, Shem, and Japheth after Noah, and that's a genetic marker, and prove that made Israelites. You hear what I'm saying? You hear what I'm saying, family? There's a live that you haven't seen, or if you've seen, is making me furious. It's making me furious because it's saying that you're taking the biblical text by a word, a one by one, saying that Adam popped up in the Neolithic around 6,000 years ago, developed all the lines of his clan. Mind you, he's saying that these are a genetic group in the Neolithic, and that in the Neolithic, you will get later on from Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And that, again, Ham, Shem, and Japheth would be literal people. And besides the fact that the scripture says they fill up the whole earth, those groups go out and fill up different areas. We know that they're in areas of Mesopotamia. We know that they're in Africa. We know they're obviously going into areas of across the Mediterranean. Now, if we know that in the Neolithic, supposedly Adam popped up in the Neolithic, left the garden, went into the world, and then became a massive culture, what haplogroup was he? Tell me one haplogroup that doesn't come from BT or CT that popped up in the Neolithic time frame. You hear what I'm saying? This is that madness that I'm talking about, of the scholarly consensus saying stuff based upon what's limitly found. What we found by limits doesn't tell us what the biblical text is telling us. We are not to go scholarly information, then biblical information behind it. We're to take the biblical information first and verify it scholarly. So this, I'm not trying to do a rebuttal or debunking on a certain video, because if I do it, I'm gonna go all out on it. But this is something I need a lot of Christians to know, and a lot of people to know, that the biblical text, whether someone want to scholarly debate it or not, genetically speaking, is talking of an origin story. If it's not talking of an origin story, you cannot say that Adam is a real person, nor can you say that Ham, Shem, and Japheth is a real person from Noah, nor can you say that Noah made a genetic family, and nor can you say that Shem has a genetic connection to other people. Because if this group supposedly only popped up in the Neolithic time frame, we will find evidence of a group that only popped up in the Neolithic time frame and never existed prior to. But that's not what we see. So everyone is either from Noah or someone's lying. It's either everyone is from Noah or someone does not understand genetic analysis enough to claim who's from Noah or who's from Shem or who's from Japheth. So I'm not saying any names right now, but I'm gonna let you know this. Genetically speaking and biblically speaking, every single human is united. Every single human, genetically speaking, is united. So there was an old Adam that united everyone together in the old Noah. Just like how there's a spiritual one, indeed. But genetically speaking and scripturally speaking, all humans would come from Noah. So for a Christian or anyone to conclude that there will be a human living today that doesn't come from Noah, they don't understand the biblical text enough to divide scholarly consensus with factuality of our reality, because that will be dividing the lot in a way. So that's got to be careful on that concept. So I just want to mention that. I'm gonna end it on this, that we do believe, right, scholarly and with a lot of information, that there was a flood and it was global. But the global event of that flood, either A, by young earth creationist method, was more catastrophic and larger and more exaggerated than more people may know, that the catastrophic event may have also caused events that cause other problems, like trying to calculate years based upon layering because of water. Or someone would take the old earth method and exaggerate the years, which is possible because of the clan method, the method of understanding clans. But that would no doubt easily make the time of Noah about 50,000 years ago. So Noah's events had to be about 12,000, 50,000 years ago. Had to be at least that for the old Earth method. There's no way around it because of the Neolithic bottleneck events, and then the concentrated information of the events of the clans. You can easily stretch it to 50,000 years. There's no doubt. But do not go around. Let no Christian, no believer in the Bible, no one, even if they're atheists, don't let them go around and say that there is a people who have nothing to do with another people. That there is a people that supposedly existed in the Neolithic. They just popped up in the Neolithic, and they have no ties with no other group. Or don't let people say that there's a genetic group of people that have no ancient roots to another people today. Because that is scientifically illogical and impossible. So there's no sense in saying Adam was a spiritual quote unquote priest in a spiritual quote unquote Eden, or a literal Eden, failed that place and left out in the Neolithic 6,000 years ago. Dwelled in the lands, developed sons that later became Noah. So multiple different sons before Noah in the lands of Earth, and genetically made men. Noah making genetic Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And from those groups from 6,000 years ago, we would get Jews coming from Shem, from Abraham. And that supposedly these Jews existed only from Noah, that existed only 6,000 years ago. No, that's not true. So just so you know, that doctrine is easily debunkable, and it can be debunked scholarly. But I don't want to go there right now. And the one who's talking about it know what's going on. But understand this, what I'm saying here is that there is no doubt that if we're taking the old Earth method, the years are exaggerated. We're taking the young Earth method, the years are still exaggerated. Something has to be exaggerated. One of the years are exaggerated. One of the years have to be exaggerated. That's the fact. That's the fact of it. There's no one-to-one ratio. You can't take the Bible and take the factual years of today and put them one-to-one and say that there's nothing within these years that has to be reevaluated. But rather, both of those concepts, both of them have to be reevaluated. Both the years, either way, has to be reevaluated. You can't take it as a one-to-one. You can't say the Bible's saying these years and this is the years. That's it. And the Earth is saying these years and these are the years and that's it. And then layer them one-to-one. And then say, yeah, it's a factual fact that Adam would have had existed and Noah would have existed. And I believe they would have existed 6,000 years ago and made all the humans that they would have made some Jews, and those would have been a group. That wouldn't exist genetically. It just wouldn't exist genetically because no humans started around only Neolithic. Unless we're talking about the Neolithic bottleneck groups. But that still proves, again, that all humans will be linked, related. All humans will be related to one group. So that'd be very important to understand. But I'm gonna leave it like that for now. I'll leave it like this. I believe that everyone comes from Noah, and I believe there's evidence of it. But I do believe that we can find evidence of Israelites. So I think we can find evidence of Israelites. I think that we have to look at SNPs carefully. Now, again, this is also why we put to challenge different haplogroups to see if those can be Israelites and examine them. So far, out of all the groups that I've seen, E1B1A would be most likely the ancient earliest Israelites, because that's a group that started after the Neolithic time frame, again, and also developed into that 12 tribe culture. Besides its Arabian brethren from the E1B1B branches and other groups that would be pre-E1B1 groups. This one has a lot to go into. I'm not gonna go into it now. Obviously, there's a playlist. We got a playlist that I recommend checking out. This one right here, or the recent one that we did, which is right here, Biblical Academic Origins. And if you see that one, I would recommend, if you want to see why these snips pretty much, this is one of them. Who are the biblical, historical, and genetic Israelites? You may be surprised. And obviously these ones as well. These ones goes over some of those things as well. These. And some of these ones as well. So these just go over the roots. So I think that it's important to look at the beginning of creation and look at that carefully, or else someone might say something that is kind of dangerous. But before we leave, if anyone has any questions, let me know. Free talk today. Any questions, any statements, anything like that. We are doing a free talk, and we are actually touching on pretty much anything that you want to talk on. If you want to talk about the biblical narrative, maybe you think there are some contradictions with it, maybe you think there's this or that, anything you want to talk about, we can touch on that real fast, since we're not doing no study today, nothing focused on anything right now. But I got some things that I'm going to talk about later about Arabia and some transitions that happen with the cities and stuff. It's going to be important for the next little thing we're going to touch on, which is the movements from Arabia and to Africa and Europe. But this is going to be, I think, interesting. I think something interesting. But I'll leave this like that. I'll leave this like that because I don't know if I should show. I don't want to touch on it right now because I always touch on his stuff, but it's because it's out of love. It's out of love of the truth. But for the love of the truth, I would touch on certain topics that need to be touched on. I think that are well to be touched on. Maybe I'll show it. Maybe I'll show it. But maybe I'll show it. Okay, I just point out two things, and maybe this will be enough. So it had to do with a certain individual that was talking on another certain individual's page about basically evolution. Which, if a Christian believes in evolution, let me show it real fast. If a Christian believes in evolution, that's fine, because we got to understand that that's not their way to salvation. Right? They're not going to be saved by that. That's not going to change their salvation. But what they need to understand is the difference between micro and macro evolution, of course. But I don't know whether to do it or not. The reason why is because I think that it was something that the individual said. I never see him do a study on it. I never seen a study on it. I never seen anyone do a study on it, on that type of method. But I thought it was kind of odd with the saying of it. So I had to kind of illustrate something because of what he said in it, just in case that comes back. But it was pretty much IP having a conversation on a certain individual's page. And when they had a conversation, what they talked about was something that I thought was kind of controversial, but I think is important in a way, but I think is one of those things that may throw some people off in a way. But it was a certain video. It's lightweight work, but it's one of those things that you gotta be careful. It's this one right here, this little one right here. Might as well show it. So, like I said, I'm not gonna touch on it right now. I may have talked about some things on it right now, but I think things like this, and anyone who's saying things like this, you gotta be careful. You gotta be careful. If you haven't seen this one, I'll just leave it like this. You should probably see that one, that one right there. And if you want me to do a review on it, let me know. Let me just show it one more time. So this video right here, I'll just show you something that he says in it, or some things that he says in it. Some little things.
The day 3 and 6, you get more closer to where God is going to make his.
I'm going to skip ahead.
I'm going to work through my image bearers. Now that we see evidence of death in Genesis 1. When we see that God says, the day if you eat of it, you shall surely die. Mm-hmm. The Hebrew more likely means birth problems. Look at the Egyptian pharaohs, for example, and all the problems they have. Failure also meant that we failed. If you want to accept the free gift of salvation, scope of argument. And I'm not. So I affirm there was an historical Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. I affirm there was an actual historical garden in a place.
All right, so okay, wait. I'm just gonna let you hear this, and you tell me if we should touch on this, because I think whenever people touch on stuff like this, the origin story gets deep, because that's the origin story. You know, I'm just gonna pause it real fast.
Place called Eden. There was an actual tree. There was an actual fall. All that's compatible with theistic evolution. Nothing. I'm not contradicting anything. I believe God created everything. He's the creator of all, according as John 1:1-3 says. And I affirm there was a literal fall. So what heresy am I holding to? None. I affirm all of that right there. So why would I deny evolution if I can hold to all essential Christian doctrines?
Interesting.
So it's an interesting method. It's a method of holding to evolution, the totality of it, and Christian doctrine, which has some problems. The reason why is because the heresy is what he says in it. He says basically not everyone's from Noah. And there's a couple different scriptures that would debate that would actually rebuttal that saying. So I'll just leave it like that. But if you haven't seen this one, this is one that for a minute, I seen this a while back, I think what was it, like a week ago? Yeah, like 2 weeks ago. I think I seen this like as soon as it came out, when he was having a conversation. I said, oh, I mean, he touches on, he has a philosophy, and he's taking a lot of different scholars, and he's bringing the best that he could possibly bring. But even if I take Egyptologist quote, he would tell them himself that you can stretch those years about 50,000 years. So the concept that he says here, when he says, you know, he believes Adam and Eve was about 6,000 years ago, but he doesn't believe in the young earth. He believes in evolution to the old earth. Then he says that he believes that Adam and Eve was physical, but he believes that they popped up around the Neolithic time frame. So it's like genetic ludicrousy. So it will bring, he don't even know it, that it's going to bring someone and make someone get debunked. Because if they try to say that the Bible is only talk about 6,000 years ago, and it was a physical individual and all these this and that, if someone starts knowing about genetics and about the complexity of the factual things of that, they'll ask some questions on that, because that statement forces the question. The statement forces a question. It's better to say, just like the biblical narrative shows us, that everyone came from Noah. Or are you trying to genetically prove that everyone didn't come from Noah? Because that, I didn't point that out on this, but that's what he talks about. There's a couple of different things on this, but this is what that whole talk, that rant was about. Just want you to understand that when I was talking about that, because that is key. That is actually a key in understanding, because we know you got your new Adam, your old Adam, right? But this is the concept of things that can be dangerous. You know, saying things, and you know, I know he's not trying to offend. That's why I'm not trying to point this out anymore, because always different Christians and different individuals, they always got that small little thing that is not about destroying them. It's just about correcting or giving them something to consider, you know. And that's pretty much what this is. This is just a examination of what the New Age Christians are kind of moving to. And a lot of New Age Christians are kind of moving this direction, where now that science got a more understanding of the world as in being quote unquote longer than it was previously thought, then you got some concepts of mind that pushes Adam's time frame out of the beginning of the biblical narrative. I bet if the biblical narrative made Adam's time frame longer and the earth said it was shorter, then that would be a more different concept to work with. But because Adam's time frame is shorter, it's easy to just layer it right on there. So which one are we setting above? Which one are we setting above in this movement here? Because I see a lot of scholars, a lot of different people, when they touch on this topic, they don't want to think that it's talking about the beginning story, but they also need to consider historically what the Jews and other people understood it as, how they understood it. They understood it as an origin story. But hey, man, so you haven't seen it? Yeah. This is one of the ones. This is like one of those. I'm always keeping track of little Christian channels that's doing different stuff. So multiple different channels, Hebrew channels, all these different channels. Just seeing what they're all bringing out. And obviously, this one was one of the ones I was actually quite disappointed in IP. It's one thing to say he believes in evolution, But it's another thing to say that we all didn't come from Noah, because that just builds on a massive problem, a massive genetic problem that actually would be solved if he actually heard what some of the geneticists are actually talking about nowadays. Now, not every geneticist is right, but there's a lot of biblical geneticists today that believe we all came from Noah, and believe that we can find that from that Neolithic divisions of BT and CT, and from all modern humans. There's a lot of geneticists that are serious geneticists today that believe that we all came from one man, one woman, really recent, and from Adam and Eve, Eurasian Adam and Eve mix, so a middle mix. So that's something that we do know. But in this video, I'll just point out one more thing that he talks about.
Yeah.
Day 2, the sea of the faith, and I'm not.
Mhm.
So right then and there, seasons, they're going to be used for
In a
mark the days and the seasons.
Adam views on creation.
Mhm.
And you hold the position of theistic evolution.
Yeah.
So could you unpack that a little on this? I don't want to go super duper.
Here's theistic evolution. They think we're denying essential core doctrines. I'm not. So I affirm there was an historical Adam and Eve.
Mhm.
I affirm there was an actual historical garden in a place called Eden.
Mhm.
There was an actual tree. There was an actual fall.
Mhm.
All that's compatible with theistic evolution.
Mhm.
I'm not contradicting anything. I believe God created everything.
Mhm.
He's the creator of all, according as John 1:1-3 says.
Mhm.
And I affirm there was a literal fall. So what heresy am I holding to? None.
So I'm sorry, this mic was still on while it was going, but this is the one that I was talking about. So first, he is assuring, like, his heart is not that he wants to contradict the doctrine of Christianity and also cause people to turn to evolution as in the only way of truth. But rather, what he's doing, he's trying to harmonize Christianity with the fact that the world accepts the modern science, that all the science, all the agreements of the science today is the agreed standard. But if only he's seen the evidences that are destroying the out of Africa concept, the evidences of how the world was trying to design multiple different lies, like the Piltdown Man, the evidences of how we actually know that they never showed genetically by nodes, only by phenotypes and bone types and structure types, how these humans are connected by microevolution. Because microevolution wise, genetically, it has not been shown these connections like that, but it's been shown in like phenotypes. And you'll see whenever you have a conversation with someone with microevolution, notice how they always pull up papers on phenotypes and bone structures and different things like that. They don't pull out genetic papers that shows the blood, because the life is in the blood. So if you start to write things based upon blood, you start to notice some things that are different, that don't fit with the said microevolution model. But if we say macroevolution, yeah, we got evidence of a diversity of speciation. Just like God said, he created a bunch of speciations, and they all have their own separate, as they develop their own separate families. So yeah, we would have a chicken mating with a chicken, making another chicken, is different styles and all that stuff. And probably you have some interesting animals, obviously the frogs that make tadpoles and all those different ones. And it looks like it's like it looks like a change or something. So you'll have stuff like that. But scientifically speaking, I think that this is dangerous. Why do I think that what IP is doing is dangerous here? Because he is saying, now he affirms Adam and Eve. Sure, that's great. He affirms Adam and Eve. He confirms that they're all physical. All that doesn't make him a heretic. But the question does. What is the question? The question is this. If Adam and Eve was not the beginning of all mankind, and was not here at the beginning of all mankind, and only existed 6,000 years ago, do they descend from the previous mankind? If not, what haplogroup were they? What genetic haplogroup was Adam? What haplogroup, right? What genetic line would Adam be if he was a physical person? And we know blood, life is in the blood. Real genetics exists. What genetic group would Adam have been? Adam, Noah, Ham, Shem, Japheth, the Jews. What haplogroup would they have been if they popped up only 6,000 years ago? And they was on a physical place called Eden? Or are they just some group of that group? Are you saying that God made him new? Or are you saying that God took him from men and made him from men? Because then he's not taken from dirt. He's taken from men, made from men. Or are you saying that that previous man was dirt? That's what I'm saying. You see what's happening there? But this is why I didn't want to just isolate this video, do a concentrated thing on it. But I'm gonna talk about it right now since it's in the middle of a live, probably like an hour or two. We're in the middle of it. But again, I think IP is one of the wisest Christians of our time. I think IP is one of the wisest Christians of our time. I just think that the previous years he has been making a lot of mistakes historically, right? Like for example, the Hyksos invasion, the video he did on Sodom and Gomorrah. If you've seen it, the video he did on Sodom and Gomorrah, a couple different ones like that is very not right. He's been doing corrections though. He's been making some corrections, and I think that people who correct themselves get better. I believe that is correction to perfection. But the only thing is, maybe I should just do this live and just let this be the review. Since I don't want to really pinpoint focus on it, because what I want to do is separate it and break down every minute of it, every single minute, because that's how pinpoint some of the things that he says in there that's going to cause some problems. And I think the individual who made this video, he wanted to make the title controversial, and I think he should never did that. I think the title was to lure people in from the controversy, but it's going to too much focus on this concept that he says there, which is the concept that there were humans before, and Adam and Eve are separate humans that developed their own family line of humans that would be separate from other humans that should genetically have no ties to other humans, seeing that they were just randomly made. But that's not true. That's not true. We don't have evidence of that a human all of a sudden popped up around 6,000 years ago. And if that's not the concept, if he's not saying that it's a human that was taken from a human and placed there in the garden, then what concept would he be concluding? But I'm gonna let you hear this real fast.
I try to interpret Genesis 1 in its ancient Near Eastern context. Now, look at what Genesis is doing. People have often brought this up. What's happening on day 4? How do you have night and day, morning and evening before the sun and the moon are created on day 4?
Yep.
So that's a problem.
Yep.
So some will try to
say there's another light source,
which is not in the Bible. So here's an example of a young Earth creationist adding to the Bible. And another light source that's not in there.
Yeah.
All right, so here's a interesting concept that a lot of old Earth creationists, they kind of try to debunk young Earth creationists, and then they don't realize that also young Earth creationists debunk old Earth creationists. But this was interesting about this concept, what he's saying here when he's saying about the light source at day 4. Now I spoke about this before, and there's been a lot of great answers for this, because even in science, we know that when the universe was created, the light wasn't there. Right? We can find this in science, that when the universe was created, everything was darkness. All the photons to make light came later. So there's evidence that the universe began as darkness and then had light. The light of the universe is the essence of the whole essence of light. That's the whole light. That's the fact that there is light, right? If you've never seen that before, you can look it up. The beginning of the universe was darkness. I'm not sure what was the best way to type this down. There's a way to type it down, maybe. AV. I'll type it down. Or rather, here, I'll type it like this. Yeah, what's the best way to type this down? Pretty much. I guess I just typed this down. This is actually a long time ago, but you can see if you take the concept of the universe and everything, apparently, like when you think of the Big Bang and all that, it didn't start off with light. The universe didn't start off with light, but actually the universe actually started off in darkness, and it actually got light later. It actually would get light much later in the universe. Long story short. It will say right here, it says, this was the moment of first light in the universe between said such and such 1,000 years after the Big Bang. So not at the start of the said beginning of the universe did we have light, but later we had light. Isn't that interesting how God said, let there be lights, and there was light, right? So in the beginning, there was no light, and then there was light, right? That's not the sun. That light, that same light is not the sun. So could there be day and night without the sun? Could there like that light like flicker throughout the universe? Maybe it flickers throughout the universe, and then there's day and there's night. Maybe that light flickers throughout the universe, and there's day and there's night. But there's stuff that's happening that we ourselves are assuming we know 100% based on where we are now, based on how it might have 100% looked like. Because remember, Big Bang is a theory, but we do know all these evidences that if we put it harmonious, it still makes sense. That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it was darkness, and there was water on the earth. And guess also what came before the sun? Water. Isn't that interesting? When you think about it, a team of researchers studying the origin of water in our solar system has concluded that up to half of it formed before the sun itself was born. Isn't that interesting how we got evidence that there was water before the sun, yet there was light before the sun. So there was water, there was light before the sun, before the formation of the sun and everything, and there was evidence of water there. And remember, the earth was a water ball. We know that the earth began as a ball of water, just like the biblical narrative says. He said, let the dry place appear. Right? That's harmonious creation. That's what that is. That's what the harmonious creation is. So when God said, let there be light, and there was light, and we know that in the beginning of the Big Bang, quote unquote, evidence that there was light later on. And then God made the sun and the moon later on. That makes scientific perfect evidence. And I had spoke about this before. But this is what I'm talking about when they take young Earth side by side and they look at the evidence, you might be in the same ability of being rebutted. So you got to remember, if we're looking at old Earth concept, we're not looking at the years at a 1 by 1. We can't say 6,000 years, and that's when Adam popped up, because it wouldn't make that. Then it wouldn't make sense. No, it wouldn't make any sense. It would not make sense that 6,000 years ago, based on the old Earth scale, that supposedly God made the moon. No, that would not make any sense. No, but if we do exaggerate the years and examine it, then it might make more sense. That maybe we're looking at these things more, less looking at it like, okay, these years of the Bible has to be exactly these years, and the years that we're looking at now, these must be exactly true. So that's one of the biggest things. Now, obviously, it's easier to bend to the world's view, to get the whole world to agree and also accept Christ. But it's harder to get the world to believe the lie. It's harder to convince the world that they have been tricked than to trick them. You know?
Yeah.
So day 1, light is created.
Yep.
Day 4, the luminaries are created.
Yep.
Day 2, the sea and the sky are created. Day 5, the animals that inhabit them are created.
Yeah.
Day 3, the land and the vegetation. Day 6, animals on the land.
Yeah.
Notice a pattern.
Yeah.
you have almost a framework here. Day 1 corresponds to day 4. Day 2 corresponds to day 5. Day 3 corresponds to day 6.
Interesting. Okay.
This is not chronological order. This is a framework order. They're doing this on purpose.
Okay.
And it shows intimacy with God. The day 3 and 6, you get more closer to where God is going to make his presence dwell, which is be on the land with the humans.
So now the reason why this part is important is because notice how he easily lets us know that it's symbolic. So if it's symbolic, that means that we got to look at the creation as a harmonious creation and understand that there's some exaggeration of the years. That's what's happening there. Because if we say, oh, those days, obviously they're going to have a symbolic
work
meaning
in my new setup here.
Yeah.
This is what they're doing in Genesis 1. They're not. It's just.
But I want to show one part. I'm not going to review this now, but I want to show one part in particular.
It happened on day 6.
See something crazy?
It's on the scene. So Michael Heiser will note in this garden, there's going to be a lot of parallels between the tabernacle and the temple. Death in Genesis 1. God tells humanity to subdue the earth. Now that word in Hebrew is very harsh. It's very harsh. It refers to. It doesn't need subdued. It's already perfect. This implies it's not. It's chaotic. It refers again to harshly ruling over something. So happen Genesis 1, and you can see my video.
This little part where he talks about. I don't know if I had to break this little thing to break that down. We already went over it, where he goes over that term, that's the scripture where he talks about they're basically going and subduing the earth, basically in domination. But I also had quoted that same phrase as subdue, also basically just to mean have ownership, to be over something, not necessarily to do it in violence, but necessarily to have dominion over it. But that's just something separate.
Well, how did death spread to all men? Well, we know. We can read.
Let's see where it's at.
So that implies human was already mortal in the old. If you eat of it, you shall surely die. From the tree of life, and now we have to die like the rest. And I just put it all on a playlist.
Adam and Eve. All of our civilization doesn't come from Adam.
Okay. Here it is. Okay, here it is. This is the part I'm talking about. Shalom, family. Shalom. All right, so this is why I kind of went on that rant earlier. So the reason why is because things that's said like this.
Find it all. Let's go to my playlist, Genesis 1 to 11, and I go up to the Tower of Babel and everything.
So all of humanity doesn't come from Adam and Eve. All of our civilization doesn't come from Adam and Eve. It comes from, there's other folks that we come
I would
from.
say there were definitely other people outside of the garden that Adam represented before God, and all fell in him. So Adam was the priest that failed, and all fell with him. Jesus is the priest who succeeded, and we all succeed through him now.
Okay, so think about that. If Adam represented a priest and all fell with him, right? And yet there were other people outside of him, that would mean that all those people outside of him had to be involved with Adam, right? Because if we're talking Adam, right, he's going to represent all the people before. But if we're talking Christ, who does Christ represent? He represents all the believers, all the Christians. He's the new Adam for the Christians, for the ones who believe. So if we're taking Adam, and he's again declared as a physical being, right? Again, he's making a statement. He hasn't said the full thing yet, but he's making a statement that there were people outside of the garden, and that Adam, again, the people outside the garden do not make, again, hear me when I say this, they do not make Israel. That's what he's concluding. He's concluding that there's one group, right, outside the garden, and Adam is another group that makes Noah, that makes Shem, that makes Israel. That's important. But he says they start around 6,000 years ago. Right? So there's a genetic factor that starts only 6,000 years ago. That throws out every single genetic group that's found Mesolithic time frame. That throws out every group that's found Mesolithic is not Israel. So any group that's found Mesolithic, Paleolithic is not an Israelite. It's not Israel. Cannot make Israelites, does not proceed to Israelites. Because Adam only started in the Neolithic time frame. Adam only started in the Neolithic time frame 6,000 years ago. So we all don't come from Adam because there was other people outside who had to be other people based on this philosophy. It's saying that basically Adam is a separate group and Noah is a separate group, and they make separate groups. And those genetic groups started around 6,000 years ago. And they have their own families. And everyone else is just some random peoples. To me, that don't make sense. But listen to the last piece right here.
So how are we saved through Jesus? Well, because he's our priest. He represents us before the Father.
Yeah.
He's the mediator, as Paul says.
Huh.
Likewise, Paul was the other mediator, and he failed, and we all failed with him, kind of thing. So it's that same kind of setup here. So if you accept that Jesus saves us through his atoning sacrifice, you also have to accept that Adam's failure also meant that we failed. If you want to accept the free gift of salvation, you have to accept that we all failed in Adam as well. And that's how desperate all men. Our priestly representative before God failed. And therefore we all fell with him. And so luckily, of course, God heals the situation through his own blood.
Do you think Adam and Eve's descendants had babies with some of the other folks that weren't necessarily their own descendants?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
bam. Why did I say? And now, why did I say that this is going to add multiple questions? It hit already. Listen to what he just said.
Other folks that weren't.
He said
failed. And therefore we all fell with him. And so luckily, of course, God heals the situation through his own.
Watch the first question. Remember how I said this is going to start questions? Because he just said Adam was in a certain place, left out, and made it with people who wasn't in that place. So now Adam supposedly, you gotta comprehend what he's saying here. He's saying that Adam is genetically different than other humans. That's what he's saying. He's saying Adam is genetically different. Adam, Noah, all that family is genetically different than those people. Then they leave that place and mate with other humans. So that means there will be evidence of this Neolithic group that mixed with other humans, and these groups would have no evidence of being ancient. That means they couldn't be here Mesolithic and Paleolithic. Or is he saying that Adam is from those people from Mesolithic and Paleolithic in those times, and that he is just a separated lineage? And then now we again have the problem of what haplogroup is he? What haplogroup would Adam be? I think if you was to take that concept in this way, and you was to make Adam, I don't know, an A00 or a BTCT mix like that, then you can try to stretch that. But I don't think that what he's doing here, that he's also considering that he's making a genetic question here. And that's why he asked a genetic question. Watch his question real fast.
Blood.
Do you think Adam and Eve's descendants had babies with some of the other folks that weren't necessarily their own descendants?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, this is a weird thing. We know from genetics.
Those genealogies are very
Yeah, well, we know from genetics that you can't have incest. It's gonna result in all sorts of birth problems. Look at the Egyptian pharaohs, for example, and all the problems they have on their mummies. I mean, they'd have incest, and then their children's children couldn't breed because they were just so deformed. So it's very likely that Cain married someone outside of the garden. When he gets cursed or by God, he says, everyone's going to come after and kill me. Well, who? Your parents?
I always wondered about that verse. Yeah.
Yeah, it's implied.
Yeah.
It's very much implied that there were other people outside of the garden.
Interesting. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to our exclusive Patreon only segment. I'm going to ask you a few more questions. The number one reason you think people deconvert or deconstruct. I want to ask you the strongest.
And I go up to the Tower of Babel and everything.
So all of humanity doesn't come from Adam and Eve. All of our civilization doesn't come from Adam and Eve. It comes from, there's other folks that we come
I would
from.
say there were definitely other people outside of the garden that Adam represented before God, and all fell in him. So
you see, now that's why I want to go over it, because you see
Adam was
why?
the priest.
You see why? Because that concept, I first seen it by Bible Project. I was kind of upset because it was like, why did you make Adam and Eve priests? Why did you design them as priests? And they kind of made a video explaining that, like, oh, they represent all mankind and this and that. And then I kind of got that concept in my head of understanding, oh, this is an old earth creationist method. This is an old earth creationist method representing Adam and Eve as symbolic, not literal, as symbolic representations of a first man. Now it destroys. Understand when I say this, that concept totally destroys the concept that Adam being the first man genetically wise, right? When we're seeing genealogies from like Luke, or, Luke tells us that Messiah went all the way to Adam. So we gotta totally throw that away. We gotta totally throw away any area where we see Adam described as the first man. We got to totally take that as symbolic when they say first man. We got to take that as they're saying the first man appointed as being a representation of being judged, and saying that anyone before that was not judged, and that everyone before that was not even yet able to be judged. That's what it's basically saying. It's saying basically if someone was a murderer back then, before Adam, how can he be judged? How can any sin fall on that murderer before Adam? And I can show you murderers in history before Adam's time. If we're saying Adam only exists 6,000 years ago, I can show you Natufians who were murdering people going down into areas of Euphrates and also areas of the Nile, and was killing people. And there's all types of different cultures that were killing people that would be before 6,000 years, because 6,000 years ago, that's only about less than 3,000 BC. Well, 4,000 BC. So there's 4,000, anything I find 5,000 BC, 7,000 BC, 6,000 BC, based on the quote unquote evolution scale, and is a murderer murdering people, you'll say that they have not been judged. Or what do you say? They have been judged, but it took Adam later to represent that judgment of sin coming on them. You see how much complexity of questions this actually can bribe up, how much questions this actually will stir up. It's better to admit the factual information that the scripture's saying than to stir up questions, because that's what this is going to do. It's going to stir up philosophical questions on if the biblical narrative, if certain, like, is it ever talking serious? Like, is it ever talking serious? Is Adam, all the descendants of Israel and all those, are they anywhere at all physical at all? And if they are physical, why is it that Adam himself, does he come from a man and a woman, right? Is he born from a man and a woman, or is he just taken and made separate from a man and a woman? And he never had a man and a woman that made him. Are we saying that Adam was just a fresh new being, or is he just like a science experiment? Like he just like a stem cell that grew up and he became basically, he's not a new genetic group. He's the same genetic group as the rest of the genetic groups, but he pops up around 6,000 years ago in Eden, and he represents all humanity with the same genetic blood. Is he the same blood as all humanity? And if he's the same blood as all humanity, why is he saying that when he left Eden and when they go mate with other people, they were not related? Why is he saying that even though in the Bible it tells you Adam had other sons and daughters, that Cain left Eden and mated with people who were not of that stock, and saying that there were other people, not other sons and daughters, but other people outside of Adam? You see what I'm saying? The complexity of questions that this startles up is massive, absolutely massive. And that this is not correct. This is not the way to go about it, and this is not correct. It's vain philosophy. Sorry, it's a philosophy. It's an idea, because right now, the idea of the Big Bang concept, the theory of it, stands. But remember who that came from. It came from a Catholic. It came from a Catholic. Let me also point this out. Yeah. Just to show this. Who came up with the Big Bang concept? You know, you get a lot of different people who say a lot of different stuff, but the Big Bang theory was first proposed by a Roman Catholic priest. So there's so much stuff that actually, if we find that train of thought, where did these trains of thought come from? They're coming from, if you even look at science, it has a foundation in ancient biblical understandings. There's a video I'm gonna put on here by David Wood. He's doing a really interesting video right now, and is about how modern science owes its origins from Christians. How modern science, the thought of modern science, actually exists because Christians were saying that God would have had organized everything in a physical stance where everything's in order, and we can find the evidence of that order. And a lot of that comes into play only later, and people only realize later that the Christians were the ones that came up with those ideas. Could it be that it might be some ideas taken from the Bible? So that's one of the biggest things. Like when you're looking at these things, don't think that some random scientist outside of the Bible that never looked at the Bible, never got any ideas from the Bible, never stole from the Bible, and put together a worldview. And he put together a worldview, and that was the standard of that worldview. So that it's important to look at those doctrines carefully, break down each one of those doctrines, look at them carefully, because then you'll start realizing something interesting, that maybe we shouldn't be bending to the world's view, but rather the world should be bending to the biblical view. But this is one of those videos that I was talking about. That's the one I was just talking about a little earlier today. But if you want me to do like just a direct pinpoint breakdown of it, again, today is just a free talk today. Any questions, statements, or if you want to join, there's a link there and everything. But anything, let me know. Otherwise, this was just something that was on my mind, my heart for a while. And I think that as a Christian, I think other Christians should not go around saying that people don't come from Noah, because that's the same dirty tricks that was used to say that all Black people are Hamites, right? The same dirty tricks. And you're seeing a lot of people who are simple in genetics that went around saying all white people are Esau or all white people are Japheth and stuff like that. But when you start looking at genetics, it tells you a more clean picture. And it doesn't always fit with people just running around and saying presumptuous stuff about genetics. It doesn't always fit that. So it requires for us to sit down and examine the information and declare it based upon scholarly information. Now, like I said, I'm not saying that IP is not being scholarly. I'm not saying that this individual is being tricked. I'm not saying that he's trying to trick people. I think he's trying to give information to the best of his understanding, evaluating modern information and biblical information, and coming to the best of the summary that he can bring out and actually have harmonious agreement in his soul. I think his consciousness is settled. I think he's also settling other people's consciousness. But I think that others who may know a little bit about genetics, like how this individual quickly said, are we all part of Noah? Other people will ask that question, and I think that's going to be the problem. The problem is the building up of questions that's going to build up from it. So I think the biblical text makes it pretty clear, and also other writers, earlier writers, Josephus, Jews, Christians, a lot of different early Christian, other writers, a lot of writers tell us that they took the Genesis story as a physical, literal origin story. And just like how this individual said, he believes that Adam and Eve was a physical individual. He believes that all these individuals were physical. But do they come from man, or do they make man? That's the question. So that's the biggest thing, one of the biggest things. So I'll just leave it like that. That's one of those questions that I believe may be a new thing of the generation coming. Who knows? But I just want to quickly just point that out. That's probably going to be the start of that, the center of that idea. Do we all come from Noah? Do we all come from Adam? I think scientifically, evidently, scripturally, we all come from Adam and Eve. And again, if you want me to do a review on this one, I would. But this is going to be a talk from IP if you've never seen his channel. Again, like I said, I don't think that he is wrong on a lot of things. I just think that he makes some mistakes. So, like I said, like how he was the first thing with the Hyksos until he talked to this Egyptologist. This same Egyptologist said that the years of the tribes can expand 50,000 years out. So he doesn't say that Adam existed 6,000 years ago. He says that the tribe elements of the tribe show that it could be stretched out 50,000 years. But he did correct him on his Hyksos video. And then he made a new, better Exodus video, which I also found true because I was working on some evidence, and from his recreation, I noticed that a lot of that was aligning with the evidence that I was finding. And so he obviously gets some. He accepts correction and stuff like that. So I think this is one of those ones he might need to get a little correction on how we have evidence that every single human being today is related. So with that, family, that's all I got for today. Just a free, holy conversation. Hopefully, I got some information I want to go over a little later. And with that, family, may you be blessed. May you be beloved. And amen, family.